The town of Oakridge was not particularly large, but it was big enough for people to find plenty of things to talk about. They talked about the price of groceries at the market, the new stop sign that was installed near the school, and the way the wind blew through the alleyways behind the main shops. But mostly, the townspeople liked to talk about Arthur. Arthur was 72 years old, though looking at him, you might have thought he was much older. He walked with a shuffle that made his feet sound like they were dragging heavy stones across the pavement. His hair was white and thin, sticking out in messy tufts that looked like dandelion fluff right before the wind carries it away. He wore the same coat every single day, regardless of the weather. It was a thick, gray wool coat with patches on the elbows and buttons that hung on by loose threads. In the summer, when the sun beat down on the asphalt and made the air shimmer, Arthur would still be seen walking around in that heavy coat, wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. To the people of Oakridge, Arthur was not just an old man, he was a local landmark. He was Crazy Art. The nickname wasn't meant to be cruel, at least not in the beginning. It was just a label that stuck, like a price tag on a vase that no one wanted to buy. Over time, however, the whisper behind the word crazy grew sharper. Mothers would pull their children a little closer when Arthur walked by. They would grip their small hands tightly and steer them toward the other side of the street, whispering that the children shouldn't stare. "That's Mr. Vance," they would say, their voices low and serious. "He isn't like us. He doesn't know where he is." The truth was, Arthur knew exactly where he was. He knew Oakridge better than anyone. He knew which sidewalks cracked in the summer heat and which storefronts reflected the morning sun first. He knew the rhythm of the town. But the townspeople didn't see his knowledge, they only saw his strangeness. Arthur spent his days engaged in activities that made no sense to the busy, rushing world around him. He would walk in tight, slow circles in the park, staring intently at the grass as if he were looking for something he had lost years ago. Sometimes, he would sit on the metal bench near the fountain for hours, waving his hands at the empty air. If a dog barked in the distance, Arthur would tilt his head and nod, as if the dog had just told him a clever joke. The local teenagers found him fascinating, but in the way a bug is fascinating under a magnifying glass. When school let out, groups of them in sneakers and denim jackets would hang out near the library. When they saw Arthur shuffling past, they would nudge each other and laugh. One brave boy, a tall kid with a baseball cap worn backward, once mimicked Arthur's walk, hunching his shoulders and dragging his feet while his friends howled with laughter. Arthur never stopped walking, he never turned around and shouted at them. He just kept his eyes on the ground, a faint, polite smile fixed on his face, as if he were listening to a beautiful piece of music that only he could hear. This smile, which seemed disconnected from reality, only convinced the teenagers more than he was completely out of his mind. "He's gone, man," the baseball cap boy said, shaking his head. "The lights are on, but nobody's home." Even the shopkeepers, who were usually patient with everyone, had their limits. Mr. Higgins, who ran the bakery on the corner, tolerated a lot, but he found Arthur unsettling. Arthur would come into the bakery sometimes, not to buy anything, but just to stand near the counter and sniff the air. He would close his eyes and breathe in deeply, inhaling the scent of fresh bread and sugar cookies as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. "Can I help you, Art?" Mr. Higgins would ask, his voice tied with impatience. Arthur would open his eyes, look vaguely at the shelves of pastries, and then shake his head. "Just listening," he would mutter, his voice gravelly and low. "Listening to what? The bread?" "The yeast," Arthur would say, tapping his finger on the glass counter. "It's singing." Then he would turn around and walk out, the little bell above the glass door tinkling softly as he left. Mr. Higgins would roll his eyes at the next customer in line. "See what I mean?" he would say. "Completely round the bend." The neighborhood was full of these small misunderstandings. People saw Arthur muttering to himself as he walked down the street and assumed he was arguing with ghosts or voices inside his head. They didn't know that he was actually rehearsing conversations he wished he could have had with people who were no longer there. They saw him stopping to tap on a metal lamppost 3 times in a row and assumed it was a crazy superstition. They didn't realize he was checking the resonance of the metal, seeing how the sound vibrated against his fingertips. The isolation was the hardest part. In a town full of faces, Arthur was essentially alone. He would sit on the stone wall outside the post office, eating a simple sandwich he had made at home, and watch the world go by. He saw couples holding hands, young families laughing, old friends greeting each other with hugs. He was a spectator in a movie where he had been cut from the script. It wasn't that the people of Oakridge were mean-spirited, they were just busy. They had jobs, families, and worries. They didn't have time to decode the behavior of a lonely old man in a heavy coat. It was easier to dismiss him as crazy than to wonder why he was the way he was. There was one woman, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable, who didn't quite believe the rumors. She lived in the apartment above the flower shop and often watched Arthur from her window. She noticed that his muttering had a rhythm to it. It sounded almost like a beat. She noticed that when he tapped his fingers on the park bench, his movements were precise, not random. She thought about going down to talk to him, to ask him what he was listening to, but the social pressure of the town stopped her. If she talked to Crazy Art, people would start looking at her strangely, too. So, she stayed behind her lace curtains and watched, keeping her thoughts to herself. As the autumn began to turn into winter, the town started preparing for the annual solstice showcase. It was the biggest event of the year for Oakridge. The brick community hall was booked, and flyers were taped up in every shop window. The excitement was palpable. The high school band was practicing every afternoon, their trumpets and trombones carrying a squeaky, energetic noise across the streets. Arthur felt the change in the air, too. The energy of the town seemed to pick up a tempo, and he found himself shuffling faster, pulled by an invisible current toward the center of the activity. He started spending more time near the community hall. He would stand on the sidewalk across the street, his hands deep in his coat pockets, just listening. He could hear the piano being tuned through the glass doors. He could hear the tap dancers rehearsing in the basement. The music was faint, muffled by the brick and glass, but to Arthur, it was a siren song. He looked strange standing there in the cold, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, his eyes closed as he conducted the music only he could hear coming from the building. The people driving by in their warm cars would glance at him, shake their heads, and keep going. "Look at old Art," they would say to their passengers. "Getting himself worked up over nothing. Probably thinks the building is talking to him." They laughed, comfortable in their understanding of the world. They were sure they knew exactly who Arthur Vance was. They were sure he was just a crazy old man who had lost his way in the world. They had no idea that Arthur wasn't lost at all. He was just waiting for the right moment to be found. And he wasn't listening to ghosts, he was listening to a symphony that had been building inside him for a lifetime, waiting for the day the world would finally let him play it. The center of Oakridge was not just a place for shops and traffic, it was the home of the Brick Community Hall. It was a sturdy, old building that had stood there longer than most people could remember. The bricks were a deep, faded red, the kind that looked warm even when the air outside was freezing. It didn't have any fancy statues or tall towers. It was simple, strong, and reliable. It sat on the corner of the main intersection, watching the town grow up around it. For the people of Oak Ridge, this hall was the heart of everything. It was where they voted for mayor, where they went to vote on tax increases, and where they gathered when there was bad news that needed to be shared. But mostly, it was a place for celebration. The polished floor inside had seen hundreds of wedding receptions, and the high ceiling had echoed with the sounds of thousands of graduation speeches. As the year moved closer to winter, the building buzzed with a new kind of energy. It was time for the annual Winter Solstice Showcase. This was the biggest event of the season for the town. It wasn't a professional concert or a fancy art show. It was a homespun affair, a messy but wonderful night where the town came together to show off whatever talents they had. The sign-up sheet taped to the glass entrance doors was filled with names of neighbors, some who could actually sing, and others who just thought they could. Inside the large main room, the air was thick with the smell of floor wax and old wood, mixed with the scent of hot coffee that volunteers brewed in the small kitchen at the back. Every afternoon, the hall was filled with noise. The high school band was there every day after classes let out. They played loud, brassy songs that shook the dust from the rafters. The cheerleading team practiced their routines in the corner, their sneakers squeaking against the floorboards in a rhythm that was chaotic but full of life. It was a happy chaos, the kind that makes a town feel alive. Arthur was drawn to this chaos like a moth to a porch light. He didn't go inside. He never stepped past the glass doors that led to the warmth and the noise. Instead, he became a permanent fixture on the sidewalk outside. He would stand by the brick wall, pressing his ear close to the cold glass of the large windows, trying to make sense of the sounds coming from within. To the passers-by, this looked like just another strange behavior from the town eccentric. They would see him standing there with his eyes closed, his head tilted against the brick, and assume he was confused or lost. "There he is again," a postal worker said to his partner as they walked by, carrying heavy sacks of mail. "Listening to the walls again." They laughed and kept walking, not stopping to see the small smile on Arthur's face. But Arthur wasn't listening to the walls. He was dissecting the music. As the high school band struggled through a difficult jazz number, Arthur was right there with them. He could hear the trumpet player hitting a note that was just a fraction too sharp. He could hear the drummer missing the beat by half a second. His fingers, hidden deep in the pockets of his gray coat, would twitch along with the rhythm. He was unconsciously conducting them, correcting the tempo in his mind, urging the young musicians to hear the music the way he did. He could hear the potential in the room. The acoustics of the hall were actually quite good, if you knew how to use them. When the choir practiced, their voices would swell up and bounce off the high ceiling, creating a sound that was rich and full. Arthur would hum along, a low bass rumble in his throat that harmonized perfectly with the sopranos, even though he was 30 feet away and separated by a wall. The janitor of the hall was a man named Gus. Gus was a broad-shouldered man who took pride in keeping the building clean. He didn't have much patience for things he didn't understand, and he definitely didn't understand Arthur. It was Gus's job to sweep the steps and lock up the building after everyone left. He often found Arthur standing near the entrance, staring at the posters of the upcoming show. One crisp Tuesday afternoon, the noise inside was particularly loud. The band was rehearsing a rock song that featured a very loud electric guitar solo. Arthur was standing closer to the glass than usual, his eyes closed, his body swaying back and forth. He was lost in the swell of the music, transported back to a time when he was the one on stage, feeling the vibrations of the piano keys under his fingers. Gus came out the front door with a large trash bag, planning to take it to the dumpster around the back. He stopped when he saw Arthur leaning against the window, blocking the path. "Hey, Art," Gus barked, dropping the heavy bag with a thud. "You can't stand there." Arthur opened his eyes slowly, the music in his head fading away as the reality of the cold sidewalk rushed back in. He looked at Gus, blinking. "You're blocking the entrance," Gus said, pointing a thick finger at the glass doors. "People need to get in and out. I can't have you cluttering up the steps." Arthur nodded politely. He stepped aside, shuffling toward the edge of the brick wall. "Just listening to the piano," Arthur mumbled, his voice soft. "There's no piano playing right now, Art." "It's just guitars," Gus said, shaking his head as he picked up the trash bag. "You're hearing things again. Go on home now." Gus marched off toward the alley, leaving Arthur alone on the sidewalk. Arthur looked down at his boots. He knew there was no piano playing right then. He hadn't said there was one. He was just waiting. He knew that inside that hall, sitting in the corner, covered by a protective blue cloth to keep the dust off, was a large grand piano. It had been there for years. He had seen it through the window when the doors were open wide during the summer fair. It was an older model, but he knew by the shape of the lid that it had a good soul. The weeks went by, and the town's excitement grew. The flyer taped to the door was now filled with names, and the list of acts was finalized. Arthur watched the rehearsals with a growing sense of anticipation. He noticed that the band mostly used modern instruments, keyboards and synthesizers. The real piano remained silent, covered in its blue shroud, sitting like a sleeping giant in the corner of the room. This bothered Arthur. It was a small thing, but to him, it felt like a waste. A piano was meant to be played. It was a living thing that needed to breathe. Every day that passed without fingers touching those keys felt like a small tragedy to him. He would stand outside and visualize the dust settling on the strings. Sometimes, late in the evening, after the band members had packed up their instruments and gone home for dinner, Arthur would linger. The lights in the hall would be turned off, leaving only the faint orange glow of the street lights outside. Through the glass, the room looked like a shadowy museum. On one of these nights, Arthur tried the handle of the side door. It was usually locked, but tonight, the latch was jammed upwards. The door clicked and swung open a crack. The air that drifted out was cool and smelled of stale popcorn. Arthur stood in the doorway, his heart beating faster. He didn't go in. He knew he wasn't welcome. But he stood in the open doorway and listened to the silence of the empty hall. It was a heavy silence, but it was peaceful. He looked over at the dark shape in the corner. Even in the dim light, he could see the curve of the piano. He whistled a very low, quiet note, a testing note, just to see if the room would answer him. The sound didn't carry far, but in his head, the piano answered him with a deep, resonant hum. "You're lonely, too, aren't you?" he whispered to the darkness. Just then, a car turned onto the street, its headlights sweeping across the front of the building. Arthur panicked. He didn't want to be caught trespassing or looking like he was breaking in. He quickly pulled the door shut, wincing as the metal latch made a loud click. He turned and hurried away down the sidewalk, his coat flapping behind him, disappearing into the shadows of the alley before the car could reach him. He didn't know it then, but that moment would be the catalyst for everything. The town saw a crazy old man running away from a building. They didn't see a man who had just checked on a friend. They didn't understand that for Arthur, the connection to that piano was stronger than any connection he had with people. It was the only thing left that spoke his language. As the date of the showcase drew nearer, the preparations became frantic. The local newspaper ran a small article about the show, listing the performers. There was a mime act, a group of children singing a holiday song, a magician who was known for making messes rather than magic, and, of course, the high school band. There was no mention of a piano solo. Arthur read the article that someone had left folded on the bus stop bench. He traced his finger down the list of names. He sighed, crumpled the paper gently, and put it in his pocket. He sat on the bench, watching the sun go down behind the community hall. The bricks turned a deep purple in the twilight. Arthur felt a heavy weight in his chest. He knew he shouldn't care. It wasn't his business. He was just the old man who stood outside. But he couldn't help feeling that the show was missing something essential. It was missing a heartbeat, and he knew exactly where that heartbeat was hiding. The night of the winter solstice showcase finally arrived. In Oak Ridge, this was the kind of event that cleared calendars. The streets around the community hall were lined with cars parked bumper to bumper, their headlights cutting through the early evening mist. Families walked together in clusters, parents carrying folding chairs and children wrapped in thick scarves, breath puffing out in white clouds as they hurried toward the glowing glass doors of the hall. It was a festive atmosphere, filled with the promise of hot cocoa and community spirit. Inside the hall, the air was warm and thick with the smell of waxed floors, old dust, and the distinct tang of nervous excitement. Rows of metal chairs had been set up, creating a sea of red and blue upholstery. The stage at the front of the room was brightly lit with portable floodlights that made the dust motes dance in the beams like tiny stars. A large banner hung across the back of the stage, painted by the elementary school art class, featuring crooked snowflakes and a lopsided sun to represent the solstice. Arthur stood outside, across the street, in the shadows of an alleyway. He was wearing his gray coat, and he had taken the time to comb his hair earlier, though the wind had already messed it up again. He watched the people streaming into the building. He saw the mayor, a tall man with a loud voice, shaking hands with people at the entrance. He saw the high school band members carrying their instrument cases, laughing and shoving each other playfully. Everyone looked so happy, so connected. Arthur felt a familiar pang in his chest, a hollow ache that reminded him he was on the outside looking in. He waited until the flow of people slowed down. The show was scheduled to start in 10 minutes. Arthur took a deep breath, pulled his collar up around his ears, and shuffled across the street. He didn't have a ticket. He hadn't bought one because he knew no one would want to sit next to him. But he felt a pull, a magnetic need to be near the music. When he reached the glass doors, the volunteer taking tickets was a young woman Arthur didn't recognize. She was busy counting a stack of stubs and didn't notice him slip past through the open door, right behind a large family. Arthur moved quickly, staying close to the wall, and found a spot in the very back of the room, behind the last row of chairs. It was dark there, in the corner near the fire extinguisher. He leaned against the wall, relieved to be out of the cold. He felt small in the large room, but he was there. The show began with a bang, or at least, a loud squeak from the microphone. The crowd laughed good-naturedly as the principal tapped the mic to test it. Then came the performances. First was a group of toddlers from the daycare center. They stood on stage in little holiday sweaters, wobbling back and forth as they sang a song about snowmen. The audience clapped wildly, and cameras flashed everywhere. Arthur watched from the shadows. He couldn't see the children's faces very well, but he could hear their voices pure, untrained, and full of joy. He tapped his foot gently against the baseboard, keeping time. Next came a magician. He was a middle-aged man in a cheap suit who tried to pull a rabbit out of a hat but only managed to pull out a handkerchief. The joke landed well, and the room erupted in laughter. Arthur didn't laugh, but he smiled. He liked the way the laughter filled the room, bouncing off the high ceiling and mixing with the music. Then, it was time for the high school band. The noise level in the room shifted as a group of teenagers in jeans and t-shirts took the stage. They carried electric guitars, bass guitars, a drum set, and a large keyboard. The drummer counted off 1, 2, 3, 4. And they launched into a loud, energetic rock song. To the teenagers and most of the audience, it was a great performance. It was loud, it was fast, and it had a good beat. But to Arthur, standing in the back corner, it was painful. He could hear the drummer rushing the beat, playing slightly ahead of the rest of the band. The lead guitarist was playing too loudly, drowning out the singer. And the keyboard player was just hitting chords with no feeling, like he was typing on a typewriter. Arthur shook his head slightly. He closed his eyes for a moment to block out the visual distraction and just listened. Underneath the noise, he could hear the structure of the song. It was a simple song, but it had potential. He found himself wishing he could reach out and grab the drummer's wrists, slowing them down just a fraction. He wanted to tell the keyboard player to play softer, to let the notes breathe. He knew the song could be beautiful if it had a heartbeat, but right now, it just had noise. The song ended with a crashing cymbal finale, and the crowd cheered and whistled. The teenagers on stage looked flushed and happy. The band members began unplugging their instruments and moving their amps off to the side of the stage to make room for the next act. There was a pause in the proceedings. The principal walked back onto the stage to adjust the microphone stand. In that moment of quiet transition, Arthur's eyes locked onto the corner of the stage. There, sitting quietly in the shadows, was the grand piano. It was still covered by the blue cloth, looking like a forgotten piece of furniture. It had been sitting there the whole time, silent while the loud rock music filled the hall. Something snapped inside Arthur. He didn't think about it. He didn't plan it. He just moved. He stepped out from the shadows of the back wall and started walking down the center aisle. This was unusual. Arthur never walked down the center aisle. He always hugged the walls. But tonight, he moved with a purpose that cut through the room. People in the audience turned their heads. "Hey, isn't that crazy Art?" someone whispered loudly. "What is he doing?" another voice asked. The whispering spread like a ripple through the rows of chairs. Arthur didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the stage. He reached the front of the room and stepped onto the low wooden platform. The stage lights hit him, blinding him for a second. He blinked and kept walking. The principal, Mr. Henderson, was standing at the microphone. He looked up, startled to see the old man in the ragged coat walking toward him. Mr. Henderson was a kind man, but he was also worried about the schedule. He held out a hand to stop Arthur. "Arthur, you can't be up here," Mr. Henderson said into the microphone, his voice booming across the room. "You need to go back to your seat." Arthur didn't stop. He gently sidestepped the principal, ignoring the outstretched arm. A murmur of concern went through the crowd. Some people stood up, thinking there was going to be a fight or a medical emergency. The mayor, sitting in the front row, looked annoyed and started to get out of his chair, ready to assist. "Sir, please," Mr. Henderson said, his voice tighter now. Arthur reached the corner of the stage. He stood in front of the grand piano. He stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked out at the hundreds of faces staring at him. They looked angry, confused, or amused. He looked at the teenagers in the band who were still packing up their gear. One of them, the boy with the baseball cap, laughed nervously. "Hey old-timer, you're lost," the boy said. Arthur didn't hear the mockery. He only heard the silence that was waiting to be filled. He reached out and grabbed the corner of the blue cloth. With one swift, surprisingly strong motion, he pulled it off the piano. The cloth slid over the smooth black surface and fell to the floor with a soft whoosh. The shiny black piano glimmered under the stage lights. It looked elegant and imposing. The crowd gasped. A few people giggled nervously. "Is he going to play?" someone laughed. "He's going to break it?" another person shouted. The security guard, a large man named Gus who usually chased Arthur away from the doors, started marching onto the stage from the side. "All right, Art, that's enough," Gus said, his voice stern. "Come on, let's go." But Gus was too late. Arthur had already made his decision. He wasn't leaving. He sat down on the bench. It was a sturdy wooden bench, firm and comforting. He adjusted his height, shuffling slightly forward. He placed his left hand on the keys. Then he placed his right hand. He didn't hit them. He rested them there, his fingers curved, his knuckles raised. The security guard stopped walking. The principal stepped back. The room went completely, dead silent. The giggling stopped. The whispering died. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. You could hear the wind whistling softly outside the glass doors, and you could hear Arthur take a deep, ragged breath, filling his lungs with the dusty air of the stage. He wasn't Crazy Art anymore. He wasn't the neighborhood joke. He was a man sitting at an instrument, and for the first time in 30 years, the world was forced to stop and listen. The silence that filled the community hall was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that usually followed Arthur when he walked down the street. This wasn't the awkward, hushed quiet of people trying to ignore a disturbance. This was a different silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when everyone in the room suddenly realizes they are holding their breath. It was the stillness that comes right before a storm breaks, or right before a great moment of discovery. Arthur sat on the bench, his back to the audience. To the people staring at him from the rows of metal chairs, he still looked like the same old man they saw every day. He was still wearing the heavy gray coat with the patches on the elbows. His hair was still white and messy. He still looked small and fragile against the massive black body of the grand piano. A few people in the back rows shifted in their seats, ready to stand up and leave if this turned out to be a disaster. The security guard, Gus, was standing just a few feet away on the side of the stage, his arms crossed, looking ready to step in. But then, Arthur moved. He didn't slam his hands down. He didn't bang on the keys like a child having a tantrum. Instead, his left hand pressed down on a low chord. It was a deep, resonant sound, like the earth itself waking up. The sound wasn't just noise, it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs, settling deep in the chests of everyone in the room. Before that sound could fade away, his right hand struck a high, crystal clear note. It was sharp, piercing, and incredibly sad. That was it. In 2 seconds, the entire mood of the room changed. Before the hands could come together to form the melody, Arthur lifted his fingers from the keys and placed them on his knees. He took a moment. He closed his eyes and seemed to gather every ounce of energy he had left in his body. He adjusted his position on the bench, sliding forward just an inch. Then, he began to play in earnest. The song wasn't fast and loud like the rock music the teenagers had played earlier. It was a slow, flowing piece of music. It started quietly, with a gentle rolling rhythm in the left hand and a simple, lonely melody in the right. As the notes filled the air, the mouths of the audience members fell open. The first thing everyone noticed was the complexity. Arthur's hands weren't just pressing keys, they were dancing. His fingers, which usually shook when he held a coin or tried to button his coat, were suddenly steady and strong. They moved with a precision that was shocking. His thumb crossed over his index finger without hesitation, his pinky reached for the high notes while his other fingers maintained the rhythm below. It was a level of skill that no one in Oak Ridge knew existed in their town. The second thing they noticed was the feeling. The music wasn't just pretty, it was heartbreaking. It sounded like a conversation you would have with someone you loved deeply but hadn't seen in a very long time. It sounded like the wind in late October, or the feeling of standing on a beach watching the sun go down. The teenagers in the band, who had been laughing backstage, stopped what they were doing. The drummer put down his sticks and walked to the edge of the curtain to listen. The girl who played the keyboard looked at Arthur's hands with wide eyes, trying to understand how he was making the instrument sound so different from how she played it. She realized that for all her lessons, she had been playing notes, but Arthur was playing music. Mr. Henderson, the principal, stood at the microphone, frozen. He had intended to grab Arthur's arm and lead him away, but now he couldn't move. He found himself wiping a tear from the corner of his eye before he even knew it was there. Even the security guard, Gus, lowered his arms. He had chased Arthur away from this building 100 times. He had yelled at him for standing near the windows. But as he listened to the music pouring out of the old man, he felt a sudden lump of guilt in his throat. He looked at the gray coat and the messy hair and realized he had been looking at a book and judging it by a torn cover. The music began to build. Arthur's head started to bob slightly, not with craziness, but with the rhythm. He leaned into the piano, as if he were telling it a secret. The melody became more complicated, weaving in and out of the chords. It sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, then suddenly like a choir of angels, and then back to a simple, lonely hum. The people in the audience stopped looking at each other. They stopped checking their phones or looking at the clock on the wall. They were transported. Mothers thought of their own childhoods. Fathers thought of dreams they had given up years ago. The people who had whispered crazy art just 10 minutes ago now felt a profound sense of shame mixed with wonder. They saw Arthur not as a nuisance, but as a man with a vast, deep history. Arthur didn't hear the audience. In his mind, the room was empty. The bright stage lights didn't exist. He wasn't in the community hall in Oak Ridge. He was back in a small living room 40 years ago. The piano wasn't a grand piano, it was the upright piano he and his wife used to have. She was sitting next to him, singing along softly. He was playing the song he wrote for her on their anniversary, a song that hadn't been played since the day she got sick. Every note was a memory. Every chord was a word he never got to say to her before she passed. He was pouring his entire life, his grief, his love, and his loneliness, into the keys. As he reached the middle of the song, the tempo picked up. His hands became a blur of motion. The sound was powerful and overwhelming. The wood of the piano seemed to shudder with the force of the music. It was beautiful, but it was also tragic. It was the sound of a heart breaking wide open. In the back of the room, a little girl asked her mother a question, but her mother just put a finger to her lips. The silence of the audience was now a blanket of respect. No one wanted to ruin the moment. They knew they were witnessing something rare. They knew they were witnessing a miracle. Arthur's face was wet with tears, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall onto his coat. He didn't care about the stairs. He didn't care about what they would say tomorrow. For the first time in decades, he was doing exactly what he was born to do. He wasn't the town eccentric anymore. He was a master. He was an artist. He was Arthur Vance, the pianist, and the world was finally listening. The melody began to slow down. The complexity faded into simple, gentle chords. The volume dropped until it was barely a whisper. It felt like the story was coming to an end, the protagonist of the song finally finding peace. Arthur's hands moved slower, savoring the last few notes. He struck the final chord. It was a major chord, full of warmth and resolution, even though the sadness underneath was still there. He held his hands down on the keys, letting the sound ring out, hanging in the air like gold dust. The note swelled and then slowly began to fade away. The room was so quiet you could hear the vibration of the piano strings dying out. When the sound was completely gone, Arthur lifted his hands from the keys and placed them gently in his lap. He sat there, staring at the black and white keys, his shoulders heaving slightly with exhaustion. He was afraid to turn around. He didn't want to see the anger or the confusion on their faces. He just wanted to stay in that moment with the music a little longer. The last note of the piano seemed to hang in the air of the community hall like a frozen star, refusing to fade away. It vibrated against the walls and the high ceiling, echoing in the hearts of the 300 people sitting in the metal chairs. For a long time, nobody moved. It was as if the entire town had been placed under a magic spell, paralyzed by the beauty of what they had just heard. There was no coughing, no whispering, and no shuffling of feet. The silence was heavy and thick, filled with a kind of electricity that made the hair on people's arms stand up. The security guard, Gus, who had been ready to grab Arthur only minutes ago, was now standing perfectly still with his mouth open, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. The high school students in the wings were peeking through the curtains, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked at the old man in the ragged coat as if he were a stranger from another planet. Arthur sat on the bench with his back to the crowd. His hands rested quietly in his lap. His eyes were closed, and he was taking slow, deep breaths. In his mind, he wasn't in Oak Ridge anymore. He was back in a memory, walking through a garden with his wife, holding her hand. He had poured everything he had into that performance, every ounce of love and every drop of loneliness, and now he felt empty, but in a good way. He felt lighter, as if a heavy stone had been lifted off his shoulders. Slowly, the realization of where he was began to creep back in. He heard the silence, but it wasn't the angry silence he was used to. It felt different. It felt like respect. Arthur took a deep breath and opened his eyes. He turned around on the bench to face the audience. He saw the hundreds of faces staring at him. Some had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others were looking at him with their mouths open in total shock. He saw the mayor in the front row, looking small and confused. He saw the mothers who used to pull their children away from him, now clutching their own chests. The tension in the room was unbearable. Arthur felt a sudden wave of panic. Had he made a mistake? Had he overstepped? He realized he had just barged onto a stage during a formal event and taken over. He waited for the shouting to start. He waited for the security guard to grab his arm and drag him out into the cold. But then, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was the drummer from the high school band. He was a quiet boy who usually kept to himself, but he was standing in the side doorway, clapping loudly and slowly. Then, the principal, Mr. Henderson, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes, and he began to clap, too. A second later, the grandmother of one of the toddlers in the front row started clapping, her hands trembling with emotion. It started as a ripple, but within seconds, it turned into a wave. The entire room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a thunderous roar. People stood up from their chairs, shouting and cheering. A man in the back row whistled loudly. The noise was overwhelming. It crashed over Arthur like a physical force. He had never heard a sound so loud and so welcoming in his entire life. He sat frozen on the bench, his hands gripping the wood. He looked from face to face, trying to understand what was happening. They weren't angry. They were applauding him. They were cheering for Crazy Art. Tears welled up in Arthur's eyes, blurring his vision. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He felt his face getting hot. The spotlight was shining directly on him, making him feel exposed. He wasn't a famous concert pianist, he was just a lonely old man who wanted to play. He didn't want a speech or a medal. He just wanted to go home while the feeling was still good. With a shaky nod, Arthur stood up. He bowed his head slightly, a clumsy and awkward bow, but it was genuine. He buttoned the top button of his coat and turned to shuffle off the stage. As he walked past the drummer, the boy reached out and gently touched Arthur's shoulder. Arthur paused and looked at him. The boy didn't say anything, he just gave him a thumbs up. Arthur managed a small, crooked smile and continued walking. He walked down the center aisle, but this time it was different. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. As he passed, people reached out to pat his back or shake his hand. A woman he had never spoken to handed him a tissue. A man he had seen at the grocery store simply nodded and said, "Beautiful, Arthur. Just beautiful." Arthur didn't say much. He just nodded and kept walking. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst out of his chest. He felt a warm glow that started in his stomach and spread all the way to his fingertips. He reached the glass double doors at the back of the hall. He pushed them open and stepped out into the cold night air. The noise of the applause was muffled now, like a distant ocean tide. He took a deep breath of the crisp winter air. It smelled like pine and snow. Arthur walked down the sidewalk, away from the lights of the hall. His shuffle was a little faster now. His coat didn't feel as heavy as it usually did. He walked past the bakery, which was closed and dark. He walked past the park. He walked until he reached the small, run-down apartment building where he lived. The next few weeks in Oak Ridge were strange. The town felt like it had woken up from a long sleep. People talked about the concert for days. It was the only thing anyone discussed at the barber shop or the post office. But they didn't talk about Crazy Art anymore. They talked about Arthur Vance, the man who had played the piano like an angel. The changes were small, but they were real. When Arthur went to the bakery the next day, Mr. Higgins didn't rush him out. Instead, he insisted on giving Arthur a fresh cinnamon roll, free of charge. "That was quite a show, Art," Mr. Higgins said, his usual grumpiness replaced with a look of genuine respect. "I had no idea." Arthur took the roll, holding it carefully in his wrinkled hands. "Thank you," he said softly. It was just a song. When Arthur walked down the street, the teenagers didn't mimic him anymore. If they saw him coming, they would step aside and say, "Hey, Mr. Vance." One of them, a girl who played the flute in the school band, even asked him if he could teach her how to play chords. Arthur was surprised, but he agreed to meet her at the park bench on Saturday to show her a few things. Even the side door of the community hall was left unlocked for him now. Gus, the janitor, had stopped chasing him away. Sometimes, in the late afternoon when the sun was going down, Arthur would go inside. He would sit at the piano and play soft, gentle music while Gus swept the floors. They didn't talk much. They just enjoyed the music and the quiet companionship. Arthur was still the same man. He still wore the gray coat. He still had messy hair. He still shuffled when he walked. He still didn't have much money, and he still lived alone. But the world around him had changed. The invisible wall that had separated him from everyone else had been shattered by the power of his song. People realized that they had been wrong. They realized that just because Arthur didn't fit into their mold of what a normal person should be, it didn't mean he didn't have value. They learned that the person they thought was crazy was actually the one who was holding the most beauty inside him all along. One evening, about a month after the concert, Arthur sat on his favorite bench in the park. It was twilight, that magical time of day when the sky turns purple and the street lights flicker on. He had a small notepad on his lap, and he was scribbling notes on a piece of staff paper. He was writing a new song, something light and happy, inspired by the way the snow looked on the tree branches. A young mother walked by with a little boy. The boy was holding a toy truck. He saw Arthur and pulled on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, look," the boy said. "It's the piano man." The mother stopped and smiled. She didn't pull the boy away. She didn't look scared. She looked at Arthur and saw a neighbor. "Yes, that's right," the mother said gently. "That's Mr. Vance. He plays beautiful music." She gave Arthur a warm nod. Arthur looked up from his notepad and smiled back. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. He tipped his head to them, and they continued on their walk. Arthur looked down at his paper. He tapped his pencil against the page, keeping the rhythm in his head. He wasn't crazy. He never was. He was just a person who had something to say, and finally, after all those years, the world had stopped to listen. The night was quiet, the stars were coming out, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur was not alone.